Good evening. Yesterday, Russian President Vladimir Putin approved a new defense budget of $126 billion, $28 billion more than the previous record high set the year before. Well, tonight we ask how much longer Russia can sustain this level of spending and analyse the impact of sanctions almost 3 years on from the start of the war in Ukraine. Well, joining me to evaluate the key insights and implications are Anastasiya Lavrina and Orkhan Amashov. But first, let's have a look at the latest developments on the Russia-Ukraine conflict that directly impact on the Russian economy. From AnewZ correspondent in Moscow, Dasya Chernyshova.
Well, Guy, we have seen more attacks carried out by both sides. The Russian Defense Ministry says Russian forces shot down 15 drones targeting different Russian regions overnight. In Donbass, Moscow says it continues to make gains on the ground. This, as Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy says Ukraine would need more security guarantees from military alliance NATO and more weapon supplies before he can hold peace talks with Russia. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz made a surprise visit to Kyiv on Monday. Scholz, who recently spoke to the Russian President Vladimir Putin on the phone, said Berlin would remain Ukraine's biggest supporter in Europe and promised delivery of military aid worth $680 million this month. And German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock said during a visit to Beijing that Moscow is dragging Asia into the conflict in Ukraine, accusing it of the use of Chinese-made drones and North Korean troops, allegations Moscow has never confirmed. Following Ukrainian attacks on Russia with the West-supplied long-range weapons, the Kremlin last week said it would hit Ukraine's decision-making centers, including in Kyiv, should those attacks continue. All that as the mass production of Oryezhnik, Russia's newest weapon, has begun. Moscow says it cannot be intercepted as this new intermediate-range missile travels at 10 times the speed of sound. How diplomacy fits into that is the real question. The Kremlin insists its operation is ongoing and Moscow wants to achieve all of its goals. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said to get to the trajectory of a settlement in Ukraine, it is necessary to solve root causes of the conflict. And he claims the outgoing administration of Joe Biden is adding fuel to the fire and escalating the conflict. Officials in Moscow say the chances of holding negotiations on Ukraine in 2025 are higher than the rejection of such attempts. However, Moscow rejects the possibility of freezing the conflict along the current lines of confrontation. Dasya Chernyshova in Moscow for AnewZ.
Well, an overview of the current state of the conflict there. But from Moscow now to Washington, where AnewZ's Obay Shabandar reports on the latest developments with sanctions impacting the Russian economy.
Fresh sanctions levied by Washington on Russia are expected to put significant financial strain on the Russian economy. On November 21st, the U.S. government has sanctioned Russia's Gazprom Bank, a key financial institution that the Russians depend upon to receive badly needed revenue for their oil and natural gas exports to European customers. And as the Russian ruble continues to slide to record lows compared to the US dollar, and as inflation rises to record highs, Moscow is going to face significant strain as it increases its defense spending up to upwards of 25% of its budget spending, with the war, of course, in Ukraine continuing to rage. American officials say that these sanctions are being placed on Russia due to its ongoing military operations in Ukraine, and financial advisors believe that these latest sanctions will make it much more difficult for Russian banks to continue to operate in the international financial system.
Well, the sanctions imposed on Russia after the start of the war with Ukraine are clearly having an impact. But in recent days, President Putin has reassured the Russian people that there is no reason to panic. Let's take a look now at the overall state of play with the Russian economy.
The most sanctioned nation in history. 2 years into a devastating war, Russia faces economic isolation. Yet, the numbers tell a story of resilience, or do they? In 2023, Russia's economy grew by 3.6%, one of the highest growth rates globally. Unemployment is at a historic low of 2.6%, reflecting a labor market under unique pressures. Earlier this year, the World Bank reclassified Russia as a high-income country, its first since 2015. The Central Bank of Russia has responded with aggressive measures. In October, it raised interest rates to 18% to combat inflation, which climbed to 8.5%, double its target. The ruble, now trading at approximately 90.8 to the dollar, faces continued pressure from sanctions and reduced foreign income. For ordinary Russians, these challenges are deeply felt. Rising inflation has pushed up the cost of food, utilities and transportation, forcing families to adjust their budgets. The depreciating ruble has made imported goods increasingly expensive, limiting access to once common products. Businesses, too, are under strain. Small enterprises face rising costs of imports and operations, with many scaling back or closing altogether. Export-dependent industries, including energy and manufacturing, are grappling with reduced global demand and sanctions limiting technological access. Some larger corporations rely on government subsidies, but with a growing share of resources directed to defense spending, support remains limited. Russia's economic growth is heavily driven by wartime dynamics. Defense spending accounts for up to 40% of government expenditures, significantly boosting GDP through military contracts and production. However, this growth does not necessarily translate into improved living standards. Projections suggest GDP growth may slow, inflation could stabilize at 6%, and the ruble is expected to face further challenges. These figures highlight the fragility of an economy navigating war, sanctions, and domestic challenges. As sanctions persist and defense spending dominates, Russia's economic future remains precarious. While resilience is evident on paper, the real impact is felt by individuals and businesses navigating a fine line between stability and strain. Ali Sultanzadeh, AnewZ.
Well, Orkhan, Amashov, a war, sanctions, domestic challenges, but also an economy that is resilient. Give us your sense of the Russian economy at this time.
Yeah, Guy, thank you very much indeed. Russia is a very unpredictable country. It's very unique. It's a unique blend of different elements, its size, population, its geopolitical interests. It's actually navigating a larger landscape. Its relationship with China is an important element to which we'll come back later. After Trump's re-election, I think that many the emerging countries felt the strain, because we know that their currencies also received the shock waves, and Russian currency is no different in this particular respect. Vladimir Putin earlier said that there's no need to panic. I mean, even if there is a reason to panic, I think that panicking is not a good strategy. And when it comes to this latest sanctions imposed on Russia, I'm not entirely sure to what extent we could explain its timing on the base of the increased urgency to help Ukraine on the battlefield, because when in early 2024 the discussions were being held about why sanctions were not working, why they had failed actually to cripple Russian economy, and why Russia was still very successful on the battleground, one of the answers provided by the experts was that Gazprom Bank was not targeted, had not been targeted, because that's a key bank. It's a key conduit which allows Russian economy to sustain itself and also allows Russian government to sustain its war effort against Ukraine. And but also we have to bear in mind that the markets are very sensitive. We remember what happened back in 2016 in Britain after the Brexit vote. Pound plummeted. There was no serious underlying cause back then. It was all driven by the sense of uncertainty. And perhaps Russian ruble reacted to this uncertainty in a way that it did. And to what extent it will be able to bounce back at a later stage, of course, it's another question. But on the whole, bearing in mind what happened over the past few decades, bearing in mind when Russian ruble lost half of its value against dollar back in 2014, which was because of the low oil prices and also Western sanctions levied against the Russian government, there is a degree of possibility that Russia will be able to bounce back. And there's another question, what Annie Sultan's report was suggesting, that Russia is currently driven by wartime dynamics. What will happen if the war in Ukraine is brought to an end? Will Russia will be able to sustain this economic growth, which is largely driven by defense industry, or will it face a new type of challenge after the end of the conflict in Ukraine? So there are quite a number of questions, and I'm afraid at this stage we don't have a clear answer.
Anastasiya, talk to me about this burden of an economy that is dealing with both sanctions and also funding a war.
Well, that's quite interesting. Indeed, Russia is very complicated, but at the same time, very interesting case to discover, to learn more about that. Of course, the first and the most important issue for Russian economy is energy. Energy development, oil and gas industry, which is being able to cover not only domestic needs, but also the foreign market, despite the fact that there is sanctions and some European countries, of course, are trying to diversify its economy, not to be so much dependable on Russian gas. We shouldn't ignore that some European countries are still importing the gas from Russia. Also, China, India, and some other countries with which Russia had stable contract agreement, coming back to the energy sources. And getting this financial support, of course, Russia can relocate it to the other needs for the domestic and military purposes, of course. The second issue, which is also helping to Russian economy, is diversification of payment methods. We know that Russia is trying to decrease its dependency from the US dollars, promoting this idea not only inside into the domestic policy of Russian Federation, but also to the neighboring countries within the cooperation of BRICS, for example, or any other alliances in the region. Russia is trying to bring an idea of forming new currency exchange policy, which will definitely dissatisfy Trump's appearance in the White House, and he already explained his concern over that. But still, Russia is trying to, let's say, use alternative payment systems like, for example, SPFC, which is quite successful in the Russian domestic economy. And then diversification of the trade partners, which also helps. Let's say if some Western countries decided to abstain from the Russian products to diminish the dependency of its economy from Russia, there are still some Central Asian countries, some Asian countries, China, even the South Caucasus countries, which are continuing to develop its trading relations with the Russian Federation, and it also helps Russia to sustain its economy. And as already been mentioned, Russia is trying to purchase for greater self-sufficiency in critical industries, all of those resources which is getting from the all mentioned above sources. I would like to add what my colleague just mentioned here. It's about oil prices. Donald Trump strictly say that he's going to dedicate much attention to the development of oil industry, despite the fact that green energy transition is also on the agenda. And if there is more oil, of course we should expect that OPEC countries, especially Saudi Arabia, will also decide to increase the level of production. And in that case, probably the oil prices will be decreased, and maybe then Russia may face some challenges. But after that, we can see that Russia is quite successful in managing all of this.
Yeah, Orkhan, despite some of those challenges, including the sensitivity to oil prices, it's possible to describe Russia as a resilient economy too. And when it comes to opportunities for growth, it's it's perhaps hard to disentangle economic policy from their geopolitical strategy.
Indeed, yeah. Russia is an incredibly resilient country, and it has managed to show its resilience over the past few decades. I talked about 2014. There was a financial crisis from 2014 to 2016, and Russia emerged out of that crisis. Again, 2022, beginning of the war, again, many people were talking about the Russian economy facing shock waves that it wouldn't be able to survive. But that stage is also over, and therefore I always take with a pinch of salt all of those arguments that the Russian economy is on the verge of collapse. As long as diversification and the resilience of Russian economy are concerned, we have to remember the fact that Russia is the world's largest the gas exporter, and I mean the gas reserve. They've got the world's largest gas reserves. I mean the second largest coal reserves, and the 8th largest the oil reserves. And also we have to bear in mind that although currently the Russian economy is very much reliant on gas and oil exports directed to Europe, in the light of diversification, in particular bearing in mind that during his latest meeting with President of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, Putin mentioned about the Russian gas being exported to China through Kazakh territory. It looks like that some of the proceeds from oil and gas may actually emanate from China, not from the Western countries. So bearing in mind the size and the resilience of the country, bearing in mind that this country has managed to survive many shock waves over the past few decades, and also its membership in BRICS, and all of these the larger elements of confrontation with the United States, and the help that Russia may get from India and China, the whole picture should not look as gloomy as it may from the perspective of many other people. I mean, after all, quite often when we talk about the sanctions, I mean, the latest sanction involves the United States, and it is effectively going to be implemented by largely Western countries. But I mean, Turkish president likes to use this phrase that the world is bigger than five, but probably the world is bigger than European Union and the United States, and there's life elsewhere. And therefore, of course, China, India, African countries, global South in general should not be forgotten in this context.
Life elsewhere, Anastasiya. But what about life within the domestic economy inside Russia? It's something that perhaps isn't focused on too much, but there has been some concern about consumer spending power, hasn't there?
Yes, of course, and we shouldn't ignore the needs of the consumers and the small enterprises, which is trying to adapt to this new global reality, which is affected by the sanctions, of course. And we can see that the businessmen and they still can maintain resilience and getting some profitability. Since the beginning, we can understand how Russia started to redirect all its sources and all its power to the domestic infrastructure development. We can see how many new factories were opened in the region, especially of the Russian Federation. Therefore, they could replace all of those most of it imported products with the domestic products. Of course, it's opened new working places for the businessmen. It decreased the prices. In the case of inflation, of course, I think that's my opinion. Probably the entrepreneurs also should pay attention to the level of prices they put on the products they have. They should take into account the possibilities of inflations and the needs of the consumers. But if the product is being produced by the domestic let's say outcomes, but not exported from the outside, therefore we should expect the price will be lower, and it will provide more opportunities for the domestic markets. We can see how Russia is also trying to bring some innovative solutions by providing some new perspectives for the employees' developments. Let's say those who were concentrated on the foreign industries, on the foreign possibilities, are now concentrated inside the Russian Federation. Then, of course, it's investments which is being invested by the government to the innovations and innovative solutions. sanctions. We cannot ignore the fact that within the last couple of years, Russia tried to invest a lot to the development of the domestic businesses and domestic infrastructural development. The first couple of years, that was quite complicated, as Russia relied a lot on the imported products, but by forming and adapting to the new realities, now is Russia quite successfully developing this direction of its policy as well. It's also the needs, let's say, those consumers who were trying to be more oriented on the imported products are now trying to select what the government and producers are offering them. So it's a long process, and if Russia already started this, that means they will try to bring more realities from what they had at the moment without asking any assistance from the outside.
Thank you. Orkhan, a reality check, a real response there to some of the restrictions that Russia's facing. Talk to us about the President-elect Trump and the tariffs that he's been threatening on BRICS nations. What effect do you expect that to have?
Well, I don't necessarily think the 100% tariffs on BRICS member countries will be put into practice. I think it's a threat. Unlike what he said about Mexico and Canada, which I'm pretty much sure will be implemented on day one, and the circumstances currently enveloping the current trade war landscape is conducive to their implementation, because the US feels incredibly confident now, and China is on the back foot in many ways. But when it comes to BRICS countries, I think it's in many ways a reaction to the talk about replacing a dollar as a world's reserve currency with a new currency of BRICS member states. I think it's a reactionary statement aimed at ensuring that BRICS countries together, whose cumulative GDP actually accounts for quite a considerable part of the world's economy, will not go that way. Because for the United States of America, amongst many other things, maintaining dollar's prestige is one of the important ways of projecting Washington's influence across the globe. For me, in many ways, it is a reaction to that talk in many ways. On the other hand, we know that Trump's re-election has caused some shockwaves throughout the Russian economy, and partly beyond the latest measure declared by the Biden administration about the sanctions to be levied against Gazprom, the ruble's fall is largely also conditioned by the fact of Trump's re-election in the first place. This is one element there. And second element there is that Trump seems to be very confident that he has all what it takes in order to end the conflict in Ukraine. And many people would say that if Trump is going to exercise considerable sway over Ukrainian government, and he has enough resources to do so, then the Kyiv may consider a certain degree of compromise solution, which will be interim solution, of course, not a full-fledged peace treaty with Russia, but some kind of ceasefire deal, which may see things through throughout 2025. But the question there is that, under those circumstances, what would be the reaction coming from Putin? Because, as we mentioned earlier, Russia has immensely benefited from the warfare dynamics, war economy dynamics over the past few years. The GDP growth was around, I think, 3.6%. And in terms of purchasing power parity GDP, Russia is world's fourth biggest economy, and nominal GDP-wise, it's about world's 11th biggest economy. With all of its natural resources, Russia has got a great deal of resilience. So in the short term, I don't expect that any measure taken by Trump's administration would be a huge the burden for Putin. But in the long run, of course, if to consider the trajectory that Russia has taken over the past few years, bearing in mind their reliance on the defense industry, I think that Russia will be able to plod on for the years to come.
And finally, Anastasiya, the war clearly is a burden economically, but it also can be seen as a catalyst for growth too. Everyone hopes for peace, but if peace comes abruptly, how difficult a transition will that be for the country's economic landscape?
As my colleague already mentioned here today, we cannot rely on the achievement of the peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine in the upcoming months. Of course, we all want to see the peaceful development, but even after the interview which Mr. Zelenskyy gave to the Sky News, if I'm not mistaken, he mentioned that we agree to consider the phase of negotiations only if NATO agree also to provide more support for Ukraine, considering even the membership of Ukraine. And we know the reaction of Moscow on this. No any membership can be considered as a peaceful development for Moscow. Therefore, even if they have a ceasefire agreement, when Donald Trump appears in the White House, as he also tries to pay more attention to that, it will take a long process of negotiations to be agreed by two sides. And we can agree that within the last 3-4 years, Russia adapted its economy to the new realities. Even if the conflict with Ukraine is over, there are still many hotspots around the globe, and Russia is active participants in many of them, including what we see today in Syria. Therefore, Russia is quite willing to relocate probably some additional sources to those hotspots. And the Middle East, despite the fact that Russia is not actively involved in the conflict, there is a still position which Russia has on what is happening today in Gaza. So, of course, there will be new adaptation to the new realities by Russian Federation, but Russia is more oriented on the regional development, to the regional perspective within BRICS, within Central Asia Communications Cooperation, with the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, and being an active member of all of these mentioned organizations, definitely Russia will try to pay more attention to its economic presence in the region, continue developing its military industry at the same time. Trump came to White House for 4 years, and who will be the next president of the United States, no one knows. And Russia should be ready. The last phase of the war learned Russia on how it's important to be ready for any development. Therefore, in my understanding, Russia will continue to invest in the defense industry in any case, but trying to relocate the earned money to the importance of its economic development and cooperation, new transport, new agreements in the region. Being an active member in many energy projects, including those European states which still rely on Russian gas.
Allow me to mention one more thing, Guy, because I think timing of these sanctions is very interesting, really. Right. November 2024, President-elect Trump will assume his responsibilities in January. Trump is on his way out. There have been some talk about Biden actually doing something tangible against Russia before leaving his office, and I think this could be regarded as something of that nature, really, because we all understand that if the intention there is to cripple Russian economy, is to ensure that Russia does not get those revenues from gas and oil exports, and that the substantial majority of those revenues come actually from the Western countries, why the Gazprom wasn't sanctioned before? I mean, it could have been sanctioned in 2023, because that's a key lifeblood of Russian economy. That is because they are dealing with all the key transactions, with all those proceeds coming from gas and oil exports. The best way to cripple Russian economy is to sanction Gazprom Bank, which has not been sanctioned until now, and it was sanctioned very recently, I mean, just now. And the question is, why now? The timing is very important. And also the question is that, bearing in mind that EU and Western countries, in particular Germany and others, are so reliant on Russian gas and oil, will this sanction be eased off at a later stage when Trump assumes his power in January? That's also another question. Because quite clearly, ruble reacted. It could be regarded as one of panic reaction, and then during the subsequent stage, ruble will be stabilized, and perhaps the sanctions themselves could be eased.
And we shouldn't forget that not all countries, not all member states of the European Union support the sanction policy against Russia. For example, Hungary, when I ask a question from the experts about their position, they're saying it's not our war, therefore we should care about our domestic economy. The situation in Germany and some other countries, therefore we shouldn't expect it to be one position of all European member states, European Union member states, together with the United States. That also helps Russia to sustain its economy.
It also taps into the theory which has been voiced by my Ukrainian colleagues, who are saying that the support we get from Western countries, from the United States and Europe, is good enough to sustain our war effort, but not good enough enabling us to win the war, So this kind of interim stage wherein Ukraine is supported but not sufficiently supported in order to defeat Russia taps into this theory that the main intention, as long as Western countries are concerned, not Ukraine's territorial integrity, but actually further deterioration of Russian economy through continuous war effort and also crippling of economy by means of forcing Russia to invest a lot in defense industry, neglecting other areas of economy.
Very interesting. Lots of different scenarios to play out. Thank you both, as always, for your analysis. And thank you too for watching. That's all we have time for on this hour. Please do stay with us on AnewZ for more news and analysis. And we wish you a very pleasant evening ahead.